Let me start by saying what I mean by power. Power is the ability to affect others to get what you want. That's a pretty simple, straightforward concept. We all use it every day in our lives. You can affect others to get what you want in three basic ways. One is with threats and coercion. We sometimes call that sticks. The second is payment. We often call that carrots. And the third is to get people to want what you want by attraction and persuasion. And that's what I call soft power. Now, in this new book that I've just written, The Future of Power, I argue that there are two big shifts of power in the 21st century at the global level. One is what I call power transition, which is a shift of power among states, which is largely from west to east. The other is power diffusion, which is a shift of power away from states to non-state actors, whether east or west. If we were looking at Egypt, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, the conventional wisdom among the experts was that you had basically two sources of power. You had the hard power of the autocrat, Mubarak and the army, and at the other end you had the soft power of the Muslim Brotherhood using traditional religious appeals, and there was no middle. What the information revolution has done is create that generation that appeared in Tahrir Square and gave them a number of technologies that helped them to coordinate and overcome problems of collective action. Now, that doesn't mean that Egypt is a democracy and everything has changed overnight, but what you have now is three actors with power. The military, which has still got its hard power, the Muslim Brotherhood, which still has its traditional soft power, and this new group of the enabled Tahrir Square generation, which has a different form of soft power. That is a different politics, new actors, because of this burgeoning of information. Sometime by the middle of this century, Asia will again be about half the world's population and about half the world's product. This isn't new. It starts with Japan, moves on to Korea, then to some Southeast Asian countries. Then increasingly it's been focused on China, with China's 9 and 10% growth rates. But increasingly it'll be focusing on India, which is now reaching growth rates of 8 and 9% a year. Very often people explain what's occurring in the U.S. and China relationship as U.S. decline. It's the decline of U.S. and the rise of China. And that leads them to the kinds of predictions of the Thucydides type that I mentioned. I think that it's not a very good metaphor. I think the metaphor of decline is often misleading for several reasons. For one thing, we don't know what the life cycle of a country is. We know what the life cycle of a human being is. For example, I can assure you that I'm in decline. But for a country, we don't know. The other problem with the concept of decline, or the metaphor of decline, as a way of explaining what's happening in the world today, is it mixes up two quite different phenomena. One is absolute decline, and the other is relative decline. Absolute decline is what happened to ancient Rome. This is not like ancient Rome. The picture of absolute decline is misleading as a way of understanding what's happening in the United States. What is happening is that China and India and Brazil and others are getting closer to the U.S. If the U.S. was here and they were here 10 years ago, they're narrowing that gap. That could be described in two ways. It could be described as the rise of the rest, or, if you measure the gap between the United States and these countries, relative decline of the U.S. But notice something. It doesn't mean the others will pass the U.S. They may not. But the concept of relative decline, if you use that, is probably not as good as the rise of the rest, because relative decline assumes that the Americans are going down and the others will pass, and yet we don't know that. If you look at power in the world today, it's distributed a little bit like a three-dimensional chessboard. On the top board of military relations among states, the world is still unipolar. There's only one global superpower, one country that can project military power globally, and that's the United States. And I suspect it'll stay that way for a decade or so, maybe more. But if you go to the middle board of this three-dimensional chessboard, the board of economic relations among the states, then power is multipolar. The economic area is one area where Europe can act as an entity, and when it does, it's bigger than the United States. Let's hope it keeps that capacity, incidentally. But there, American power can be balanced by Europe, China, India, Brazil, rising powers, Japan. The world is multipolar at this middle board. But if you go to the bottom board of the three-dimensional game, the board of transnational relations, things that cross borders outside the control of governments, and that can be everything from massive financial flows that are larger than the budgets of some countries. It could be things like terrorism. It could be things like cyber terrorism. It could be things like climate change or pandemics. Here, power is chaotically distributed. This is where the diffusion of power in the non-state actors comes in. It makes no sense to call this bottom board of transnational relations unipolar or multipolar. The only way you can deal with this new diffusion of power that's raising these challenges on the bottom board is through cooperation. You have to use your soft power to organize networks of government to cooperate to deal with these problems.